Good afternoon, 8th graders. Let's get into the homework today. Make sure you have your paper out in front of you, and we're going to be turning to page 177. We're really getting through this book, which is the beginning of chapter 16. 177, beginning of chapter 16. We're going to read just about 3 pages today and figure out more about how things ended up with Jem, Scout, and Atticus after the unfortunate mob came to the jail. Let's get started. Chapter 16. Jem heard me. He thrust his head around the connecting door. As he came to my bed, Atticus's light flashed on. We stayed where we were until it went off. We heard him turn over, and we waited until he was still again. Jem took me to his room and put me in bed beside him. Try to go to sleep, he said. It'll be all over after tomorrow, maybe. We had come in quietly so as not to wake Auntie. Atticus killed the engine in the driveway and coasted to the car house. We went in the back door and to our rooms without a word. I was very tired and was drifting into sleep when the memory of Atticus, calmly folding his newspaper and pushing back his hat, became Atticus standing in the middle of an empty waiting street, pushing up his glasses. The full meaning of the night's events hit me, and I began crying. Jem was awfully nice about it. For once he didn't remind me that people nearly 9 years old didn't do things like that. Everybody's appetite was delicate this morning, except Jem's. He ate his way through 3 eggs. Atticus watched in frank admiration. Aunt Alexandra sipped coffee and radiated waves of disapproval. Children who slipped out at night were a disgrace to the family. Atticus said he was right glad his disgraces had come along, but Auntie said nonsense. Mr. Underwood was there all the time. You know, it's a funny thing about Braxton, said Atticus. He despises Negroes, won't have one near him. Local opinion held Mr. Underwood to be an intense, profane little man, whose father, in a fray fit of humor, christened Braxton Bragg, a name Mr. Underwood had done his best to live down. Atticus said naming people after Confederate generals made slow, steady drinkers. Calpurnia was serving Aunt Alexandra more coffee, and she shook her head at what I thought was a pleading, winning look. You're still too little, she said. I'll tell you when you ain't. I said it might help my stomach. All right, she said, and got a cup from the sideboard. She poured 1 tablespoon of coffee into it and filled the cup to the brim with milk. I thanked her by sticking out my tongue at it and looked up to catch Auntie's warning frown. But she was frowning at Atticus. She waited until Calpurnia was in the kitchen. Then she said, Don't talk like that in front of them. Talk like what in front of whom? He asked. Like that in front of Calpurnia. You said Braxton Underwood despises Negroes right in front of her. Well, I'm sure Cal knows it. Everybody in Maycomb knows it. I was beginning to notice a subtle change in my father these days that came about when he talked with Aunt Alexandra. It was a quiet digging in, never outright irritation. There was a faint starchiness in his voice when he said, anything fit to say at the tables, fit to say in front of Calpurnia. She knows what she means to this family. I don't think it's a good habit, Atticus. It encourages them. You know how they talk amongst themselves. Everything that happens in this town's out of the quarters before sundown. My father put down his knife. I don't know of any law that says they can't talk. Maybe if we didn't give them so much to talk about, they'd be quiet. Why don't you drink your coffee, Scout? I was playing in it with the spoon. I thought Mr. Cunningham was a friend of ours. You told me a long time ago he was. He still is. But last night he wanted to hurt you. Atticus placed his fork beside his knife and pushed his plate aside. Mr. Cunningham's basically a good man, he said. He just has his blind spots along with the rest of us. Jem spoke. Don't call that a blind spot. He'd have killed you last night when we first went there. He might have hurt me a little, Atticus conceded. But, son, you'll understand folks a little better when you're older. A mob's always made up of people, no matter what. Mr. Cunningham was part of a mob last night, but he was still a man. Every mob in every little southern town is always made up of people you know. Doesn't say much for them, does it? I'll say not, said Jim. So it took an 8-year-old child to bring them to their senses, didn't it? Said Atticus. That proves something, that a gang of wild animals can be stopped, simply because they're still human. Maybe we need a police force of children. You children last night made Walter Cunningham stand in my shoes for a minute. That was enough. Well, I hoped Jem would understand folks a little better when he was older. I wouldn't. First day Walter comes back to school, it'll be his last, I affirmed. You will not touch him, Atticus said flatly. I don't want either of you bearing a grudge about this thing, no matter what happens. You don't see, do you? Said Aunt Alexandra. What comes of things like this? Don't say I haven't told you. Atticus said he'd never say that, pushed out of his chair, and got up. Turn the page. There's a day ahead, so excuse me, Jim. I don't want you and Scout downtown today, please. Pausing there. Because today, downtown, the case will begin. So he's like, don't come downtown. I'm going to be real busy. We're going to find out what happens with all that tomorrow. So make sure that you are reading carefully tonight for homework, and I'll see you then. Complete the questions on the page. Have a good evening.